no doubt whatsoever that the bloody hand of the Dominican dictatorship was involved in yesterday's attack. But that dictatorship is living its final moments. These are the final thrashings of a prehistoric animal incompatible with the 20th century.
On a morning of June 24, 1960, in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, Rómulo Betancourt, who was then president of the nation, was traveling along Los Próceres Avenue to lead a series of official events. Already near his destination, without anyone noticing, in a surprising way, he hears a loud explosion causing the area around the presidential Cadillac, along with all its occupants, to turn into a ball of fire. Venezuela was paralyzed by the news of an attack and possible assassination of the President of the Republic. And the government's initial accusations would make the situation even more scandalous, as Venezuela directly accused the President of the Dominican Republic for almost 30 years, Rafael Leonidas Trujillo, of being responsible for this attack. But how did it come to this situation? A situation almost never seen before in the history of the Americas, between two sitting presidents, where both accused each other of conspiring against the other's life from abroad. How did this attack unfold, and where did this not-so-well-known and historic rivalry between Rómulo Betancourt and Rafael Trujillo come from? Join us to find out today. This is Reynaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches speaking, and this is the New Encyclopedia. Please support us by liking this video and leaving comments, which we always read, by turning on notifications with the bell, subscribing to the channel, of course, and sharing this material with all your contacts on WhatsApp, on social media, and anywhere else. So, without further ado, let's begin today's story. To talk about the background behind Trujillo's attack on Betancourt, we have to go back a few years. The first contact between Trujillo and Betancourt happened in 1929. Betancourt at that time was a student political leader who opposed the regime of Juan Vicente Gómez and was exiled in the Dominican Republic. From there, he gave lectures against the Venezuelan government and gathered support for movements aimed at overthrowing it, like the famous Falk expedition, which took place in August 1929. In view of this, the Venezuelan government formally requested the Dominican government to monitor Betancourt. For this purpose, the task was assigned to then Brigadier General of the Dominican National Police, Rafael Trujillo, who just a year later took power in that country after a conspiracy. He ruled as a dictator for the next 30 years in a period that, besides being autocratic, would also be remembered as one of economic expansion and political stability. Meanwhile, Venezuela over time experienced a gradual political opening aimed at establishing an institutional democracy. After the death of Gómez in 1935, this period lasted for almost 10 years, first led by Eleazar López Contreras and then by Isaías Medina Angarita. Around this time, Betancourt returned to the country and founded the Acción Democrática Party, with which he would move skillfully through national politics, managing to grow in popularity. A few years after this, Betancourt and his party managed to gain political power. In October 1945, after taking part in a civil-military conspiracy promoted by sectors of the military leadership, they overthrew then-President Medina Angarita and established a revolutionary government junta, presided over by Rómulo Betancourt. This paved the way for a turbulent 3-year period known as the Adeco Triennium from 1945 to 1948, marked by a tense political and social situation nationwide and by strong conflicts between political and military sectors opposed to the government. Democratic action. And it should be noted that on the very day of the coup against Medina Angarita, October 18, 1945, the first conflict occurred between Betancourt's Venezuela and Trujillo's Dominican Republic. When mobs in favor of the Democratic Action coup, also accompanied by opponents of Trujillo who were exiled in Venezuela, violently stormed the Dominican embassy in Caracas. As a result of this event, there was an escalation of tension between both governments, which would end with the expulsion of the Dominican representative in Venezuela, to which Trujillo responded in kind, leading to the breaking of diplomatic relations between the Dominican Republic and Venezuela. Since he was assigned as a Dominican brigadier to watch over that Venezuelan exile named Romulo Betancourt in the Dominican Republic, Rafael Trujillo had distrusted that man, and those two figures who once crossed paths would now preside over the highest office in each of their countries. At the same time, on the international stage, there would also be growing tensions throughout the Caribbean among governments aligned with liberal democracy, with figures like Ramon Grau San Martin or Carlos Prio, Socarrás, Cuba, José Figueres, Costa Rica, Muñoz Marín, Puerto Rico, and Rómulo Betancourt, Venezuela, against more nationalist and autocratic governments like that of Anastasio Somoza Garcia in Nicaragua and Rafael Leónidas Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. All of this, moreover, in a turbulent context like that of the Cold War and the growing hegemony of the United States as the sole empire across the planet. Enemies? In this way, Trujillo and Betancourt would actually help each other's clandestine operations in an attempt to make it easier for dissidents from both governments to overthrow their adversary. During just the 3-year period, Acción Democrática Betancourt faced 8 attempted uprisings, 3 of which would be directly supported by Rafael Trujillo. Meanwhile, in Trujillo's case, he also faced a military expedition from Cuba, backed by Guatemala, Costa Rica, Mexico, and Venezuela, though it did not result in his overthrow. After these unresolved conflicts, later on, relations between the Dominican Republic and Venezuela briefly improved with the presidential election of the writer Rómulo Gallegos at the end of 1947. This was despite statements made by Betancourt in April 1948 during the founding of the organization. He called for zero contact with autocratic governments like that of Rafael Trujillo. Now then, this diplomatic rapprochement between the administrations of Gallegos and Trujillo would be interrupted by a new military coup just a few months after these approaches, specifically on November 24, 1948. With this coup, led by the military high command, Venezuela entered what is known as the military decade. Between 1948 and 1958, with governments headed by Carlos Delgado Chalbo until 1950 and later, both de facto and nominally, by Marcos Pérez Jiménez until 1958. After the government changed, Betancourt and many comrades went into exile in 1949. This, however, did not mean the end of the struggles between Trujillo and Betancourt. The rise of military governments in Venezuela, especially under Marcos Pérez Jiménez, would eventually improve diplomatic relations between Trujillo's Dominican Republic and Venezuela. Even a so-called anti-subversive network was formed throughout the Caribbean, promoted by the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Honduras, who supported the emerging government of Pérez Jiménez to control armed subversive groups. During these years, Acción Democrática and leftists, inside and outside Venezuela, unsuccessfully tried to violently overthrow the governments of Delgado, Chalbo, and Pérez Jiménez. While all this is happening, despite his friendship with sectors of the American elite, Betancourt, as an exile, travels throughout the Caribbean, constantly monitored by Venezuelan and Dominican intelligence services, in addition to facing multiple assassination attempts. First in Havana, Cuba in 1951, then in Mexico and Puerto Rico in 1955, where, according to historian Santiago Castro, Dominican security agents planned to kidnap Betancourt and later take him to rejection. Dominican Republic, although none of this would happen. However, by the end of 1957 and the beginning of 1958, the opposition to Pérez Jiménez in Venezuela and abroad, supported by sectors of the armed forces in the United States, they joined forces to create a tense situation that forces Pérez Jiménez to leave power. On January 23, 1958, paving the way for a provisional government junta headed by Rear Admiral Wolfgang Larrazabal. That same year, general elections were held in which Rómulo Betancourt emerged victorious after returning from exile, thus beginning his second presidency, which would last from 1959 to 1964. This new presidency would open a new chapter in the conflict between Betancourt and Trujillo, who, it should be said, was still standing firm as a rock, commanding in the Dominican Republic. But few knew that these tensions were about to reach their climax. The year 1959 would be a remarkable year in the rivalry between Trujillo and Betancourt. The first, who had ruled with an iron fist for almost 30 years, began to feel pressure from both internal and external elements against his government. Regimes close to his own, like Batista's in Cuba and Pérez Jiménez's in Venezuela, had recently been overthrown. And for the geopolitical interests of the hegemon, which was the United States, Trujillo no longer seemed so convenient, and the northern power starts to turn its back on him a little. For his part that same year, Betancourt returned to the presidency of Venezuela, but in a situation of constant tension, characterized by great uncertainty and political conflict, which led to the emergence of several dissident groups, including radical leftist factions that sought to carry out an armed coup. This all occurred amid fiscal disorder caused by the Larrazabal military junta, which took power after Pérez Jiménez fell. Under these circumstances, the tensions between the main figures in this story would resurface again in just a few months. Venezuela resumed a principle in foreign policy that had been developing since the years of the Acción Democrática triennium, and it was known as the Betancourt Doctrine, which promoted that no government in the world should recognize other governments that originated from what they called anti-democratic procedures. Using as the clearest example, according to them, Trujillo's Dominican Republic, which, it's worth mentioning, was the first place that welcomed Marcos Pérez Jiménez after he left Venezuela. Based on this so-called doctrine, Betancourt, which some considered interventionist because it sought to dictate how countries should conduct their internal policies, and whose criteria became more than ambiguous when it came to their applicability in real diplomatic practice. Betancourt had not even been president of Venezuela for 6 months when he makes statements and protests in international organizations against the supposed permissiveness in the region toward the Trujillo government. This sparks a new clash and breaks diplomatic ties between the Dominican Republic and Venezuela. In June 1959, at the height of this conflict, a siege by shock groups loyal to Trujillo against the Venezuelan embassy in Santo Domingo. At the same time, Trujillo faces a short and failed military operation led by Enrique Jiménez Moya, which had support from Cuba under the newly arrived Fidel Castro. This operation initially had Venezuelan support, but Betancourt's government eventually hesitated and decided not to support it any longer. To avoid an escalation that would put Acción Democrática and Betancourt in a difficult position with the armed forces, a military sector that was also beginning to have various disagreements with Rómulo Betancourt. However, although this conspiracy against Trujillo was stopped, the Dominican leader would continue to strongly suspect Betancourt and the Venezuelan government of being involved in this plot. At that moment, Trujillo decided, in response to this, to organize an assassination attempt against Betancourt himself, which was to be carried out the following year, that is, in 1960. Meanwhile, this rivalry kept escalating and was made easier by the growing discomfort of the United States with Trujillo regarding their geopolitical interests in the region. The Northern power is putting more pressure on the Dominican Republic to alter its government model. Because contrary to what is often thought, the more than 30-year relationship between the United States and Trujillo's Dominican Republic was far from harmonious on many occasions. In addition, Betancourt, who was much more openly aligned with the North, would take this conflict to the Organization of American States, demanding that President Trujillo and his government be diplomatically isolated in order to push for a so-called democratic transition and greater guarantees for the Dominican political opposition, which was against Trujillo and also aligned with the United States. And this conflict continued both within the diplomatic arena and outside of it. Trujillo, for example, provided logistical support to the military attempt by the former Venezuelan Minister of Defense, Jesus Maria Castro León, in the state of Táchira. The April 1960 uprising was supplied with weapons, money, and fake passports. Betancourt, who had also supported armed expeditions, as we mentioned, against Trujillo, took full advantage of this failed coup against him to make his position even stronger. His request was that the international community, mainly the Organization of American States, isolate Trujillo's government and put pressure for its change. As a result, Rafael Leónidas Trujillo becomes more isolated and blocked. Diplomatically, Trujillo realizes that one of the main problems for his government was diplomatic policy, whose main face was Rómulo Betancourt. So fate, tempers, the cards, and everything else were set for the controversial and unexpected plan to remove Betancourt from the map of Venezuela to be carried out through a violent action organized by Trujillo's regime. That same year, 1960, Rivalries. To carry out such a complex operation, Trujillo assigns this mission to Johnny Aves Garcia, director of the Dominican Secret Police, known as the Military Intelligence Service. Aves Garcia was not an unknown figure. In the previous failed assassination attempt against Betancourt, carried out in Mexico, he had participated as a second-level official. To advance his mission, Aves contacts a diverse group of actors, coordinated in Venezuela, Santo Domingo, and Madrid, which involved sectors with ties or sympathies toward the recently overthrown Marcos Pérez Jiménez, even though the latter had no connection whatsoever to those plans. Such will be the case of Corvette Captain Eduardo Morales Luengo, who will act as the local chief in Venezuela, from the plot to former Colonel Oscar Tamayo Suarez and Juan Manuel Zanoja Rodriguez. They also had Colonel Martinez, who was impartial and did not support Pérez Jiménez, along with civilian sectors disaffected with Betancourt, being, as we have said, a rather heterogeneous group. Trujillo provides supplies, weapons, funding, and training to the conspirators in order to end Betancourt's life. With a 65-kilogram trinitrotoluene bomb hidden in a vehicle that would be parked near the route Betancourt was going to take on June 24, 1960. The bomb would be detonated with a remote microwave device which was extremely sophisticated for that time. Civilians Luis Cabrera Cifuentes and Manuel Vicente Yanes Bustamante would be responsible for detonating the bomb. The plan was not only to end Betancourt's life, but also to organize civil military actions in different parts of the country to take advantage of the situation and seize power. However, not everything would go as the conspirators had planned. As we mentioned, around 9:30 in the morning on June 24, 1960, Betancourt, who was feeling somewhat unwell that day, he passed through Los Procheries Avenue in Caracas to preside over the commemorative events of the Battle of Carabobo and Army Day. On the Paseo de los Ilustres, in the presidential Cadillac were Betancourt, his wife Renee Mercedes, the Minister of Defense Josué López Enríquez, and the driver Azael Valero, accompanied by the presidential escort vehicle and the entourage. When the conspirators were about to detonate the explosive It failed because the bomb could not properly reach the rear section of the car in which they were traveling. Betancourt was not affected. Instead, it was the front part that was hit, pushing the vehicle several meters off the road until it crashed into a median strip. Everything turned into smoke and fire, although the explosion did not hit the main target. In the attack, the head of the military house, Ramon Armas Perez, and a passerby named Juan Eduardo Rodriguez Betancourt died, both suffering widespread first and second-degree burns on their faces and hands. He is rescued from the scene and taken to a medical center, where, despite his injuries, he is alive and stable. From there, he gives a brief statement to the press, and the next day at the Miraflores Palace, he delivers a radio speech in which he accuses Trujillo of being the mastermind behind the attack, along with members of the former Perez Jimenez regime. He also orders to find those directly responsible for the attack in Venezuela, who are captured in the following days. The leaders of the operation, Luis Cabrera Tifontes, Juan Manuel Sanoja, and Eduardo Morales, are sentenced to 30 years in prison. As soon as the news becomes public, Trujillo will go out and deny everything that happened, calling the events an incident of Venezuelan domestic politics, making sure not to leave any direct evidence of his involvement. However, this evidence soon begins to emerge. La Voz Dominicana, the official government radio station, had announced on the day of the attack a news bulletin stating that Betancourt had died in an attack 18 minutes before it actually happened, even though the first official information coming from Venezuela was released around noon, much later than 9 in the morning when the events took place. On the other hand, and even more importantly, the conspirators in Venezuela began confessing what happened as they surrendered or were captured, directly involving Rafael Trujillo in the events. Faced with this situation, Trujillo chose to make symbolic gestures, such as replacing his brother Hector Trujillo as president with Joaquin Balaguer, who was vice president at the time, among other actions aimed at preventing greater international pressure. The Dominican Republic had dealt with this for years because of Betancourt, but now it would worsen. Tensions are growing and rising within the Organization of American States. A commission is appointed to investigate what happened in Venezuela, and this commission states that it has concluded that the participation of the Dominican Republic was real. This is something that Trujillo continues to deny after intense sessions in which Venezuela will seek to gather support to further isolate the Dominican regime economically and diplomatically. Betancourt even considers the possibility of launching possible military retaliations in what will be known as Operation Lightning. But this possible military conflict will ultimately be ruled out by both sides due to fears of possible economic, diplomatic, and military costs. The Organization of American States after the attack will vote in a historic session. The United States, the region's most influential player, first, it would be reluctant to apply pressure measures against the government of the Dominican Republic for fear of a possible regime change. Could the power vacuum left by Trujillo lead to the establishment of a regime like Castro's Cuba? However, they eventually side with Betancourt, and the Venezuelan president gains the support of the United States and most countries in the Organization of American States. So after this, the Organization of American States submits a report to the United Nations Security Council with the sanctions that should be applied to Trujillo. And through a resolution on September 9, 1960, the United Nations approves these sanctions against the Dominican Republic. In this way, Trujillo's government would be diplomatically isolated, and the Dominican Republic would experience strong economic restrictions, which would encourage unrest and internal political conflict in the Dominican Republic. Finally, in this context, a few months later, one of the most intense rivalries of 20th century Latin America would come to an end. On May 30, 1961, Trujillo was traveling to San Cristobal from the capital, Ciudad Trujillo. now Santo Domingo, with less protection than usual. He was heading to a property located on the outskirts of the city when suddenly his car was riddled with bullets, killing him. Trujillo, the president then, the conspirators, who had the support of one of Trujillo's aides, Lieutenant Amado Garcia Guerrero, would be hunted down shortly after by his son Ramfis Trujillo, who immediately took de facto control of the Dominican Republic. However, the wounds that Trujillo's assassination left on the Trujillo regime would prove to be fatal, because these events led to a rebellion within the Dominican Air Force that ultimately overthrew what was left of the Trujillo regime, which lasted over 30 years in late November 1961. Thus ended not only one of the most controversial and debated governments in Hispanic America, but also one of the longest and least known political rivalries of the 20th century. As for Betancourt, after recovering from the attack, he was left with injuries that affected him: his head, right eye, and left him partially deaf. Betancourt, although with many difficulties, managed to finish his term in 1964 and would die after several years of political activity in 1981 at the age of 73 due to an embolism caused by a fall. Thank you all from the bottom of my heart for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I remind you that you give us a big boost and a great help by interacting with the channel, leaving your comments, liking the videos, sharing the material on social media, on WhatsApp, and in any other space, and by activating the bell so you get notifications every time we publish new material. Thank you all again, and may God bless you.